Hello, everybody, and welcome to our fireside chat with three amazing panelists. I'll introduce them in a few minutes. My name is Meghan Irons, and currently I am an investigative reporter for the Spotlight team at the Boston Globe. But I am very excited to know that very soon I will be on the faculty at Boston University in January. So this is gonna be my home. Pretty excited about that. I hope you were here for most of today and you've had some time to enjoy the discussion. And what a discussion it's been all day. I've learned so much, and I want to thank everybody who's participated throughout the day in giving their insights, sharing their vision, and leaving all of us all the more wiser as we depart today. But before I introduce our panelists, I want to talk to you about this fireside chat and this keynote conversation. It's named in honor of an extraordinary journalist and a College of Communication alumna, Ida Lewis. Did somebody say yeah? Ida Lewis was a Paris correspondent for newspapers and magazines in the 1960s, including Life and the New York Times. She went on to become the first editor-in-chief of Essence magazine. Later, she became the first Black woman to publish a national magazine when she founded Encore, a news magazine that explored African-American perspectives on global issues. We all stand on the shoulders of trailblazers like Ida Lewis, and we are honored to be honoring her by gathering here now for the Ida Lewis COM'56 keynote conversation. So now we're going to have a conversation with some trailblazers on their own, pioneers in their own right. First, let me introduce them. Paula Madison, and let me just preface this by saying this is by no means an extensive list of their accomplishments, but I just want to give you a taste of the talent and esteemed professionals that we have on stage today. Paula is a trailblazing journalist, author, and business executive, and she's an inspiration to many women and many people who have followed her through the years. She's currently CEO of Madison Media Management, LLC, and 88 Madison Media Works, Inc. She's on the board of her family's investment company, which is also a majority shareholder in the Africa Channel, a cable and streaming channel. The company also bought and sold the Los Angeles Sparks, which was sold to Magic Johnson in 2014. Her documentary, Finding Samuel Lowe, China, Jamaica, where I'm from, by the way, Harlem, traces her maternal grandfather's roots to China. Welcome. Welcome, Paula. Next to her is Kevin Merida, who became the executive editor of the Los Angeles Times last year and oversees the largest newspapers in the West, along with the Times Community News and Los Angeles Times en Español. Previously, he was senior vice president at ESPN, where, among other things, he oversaw the investigative news and enterprise unit. As editor-in-chief of The Undefeated, Kevin brought the multimedia platform back to life with rich stories that capture the intersection of race, sports, and culture. And I will say that the careers of young Black journalists blossomed under Kevin's leadership. Prior to that, he worked for the Washington Post for many years and had a number of roles. He is also a graduate of BU. Welcome, Kevin. And last but not least is Dr. Ibram Kendi, one of America's foremost historians and leading anti-racist scholars. He is BU's Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities and the founding director of the university's Center for Antiracist Research. A well-published author and writer, Dr. Kendi was named by Time magazine in 2020 as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. His growing lists of books include The Black Campus Movement, which won the W.E.B. Du Bois Book Prize and stamped from the beginning the definitive history of racist ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2016. He's also the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. Welcome, panel. Thank you for being here. I know some of you came near and far, right? I want you to take a look back at the past 2 years. We've had George Floyd. We had a national reckoning on race. We saw a response to that, the surge in hiring and recruiting of Black people in positions both from the ground level to the top floor. So these are really good, right? This is what we've all, as journalists who've been in the profession for a very long time, worked hard to achieve. But somehow, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of fleeting. I've heard today people talk about imposter syndrome and performative. What is your takeaway about what these 2 years have been? What's been good about it? And what do you think you're worried about? Paula, do you want to take that first? And we'll just go down the list.
Sure. First, I'd like to thank you all for having me. And I want to know how all these Black professors are getting hired here at BU. It makes me a little envious. All right, got that out of the way. The past 2 years, I will share a short anecdote that I was fortunate enough to hear about 15 years ago, or maybe more. Ron Meyer at the time was the chairman of Universal, and I had been executive vice president there, and blah, blah, blah. And I had an assemblage of 150 African-American women, Black women on Wall Street. Executive Leadership Council assembled them. And someone asked Ron, what will it take for Black people to finally be able to greenlight a film in Hollywood? And this is what Ron said. Suzanne DePass was on the panel, John Singleton was on the panel, Warrington Hudlin was on the panel, somebody else, and Ron, I can't remember who the other person was. And Ron said, somewhere in the early 1900s, the motion picture industry was created by 6 old white European Jews. Today, the motion picture industry is run by 6 old white European Jews. He said they're men, well, maybe there's a woman in there, but it's 6 old white European Jews. I was like, where's he going with this? And he said, and you want us to turn it over to your family because why? And I was the only person who applauded. And I applauded because I thought it was time that we heard that out loud from somebody at the tippy top. We could talk about reparations and what we're owed and how it was all unfair, but the bottom line is that, for example, United Artists, that studio was created when the actors and actresses in the industry felt that they weren't being allowed to tell the stories they wanted to tell. So they created what? United Artists. One could ask the question, well, does the African-American Black community here in the United States have enough capital income to create its own stuff? The answer is yes. Why don't we create our own stuff as a collective? I think because historically, one of the major influences is that we've been taught to not trust each other. So what have we learned in the past 2 years? In the past 2 years, what I saw was a lot of video that showed young people, Gen Zs and millennials, arms linked, regardless of race or gender, out in the streets, protesting the murder of George Floyd. For that, I was very happy. When I saw people my age, and I'm 70, when I saw people my age being interviewed by my people who I used to call fellow journalists, almost always they were Black people being interviewed. And I wondered, where was that multiracial picture? When were we going to see that? So I called two friends in Congress. One was Representative Barbara Lee from Northern California, African American Lee, and one was Judy Chu, Chinese American legislator from Southern California. And I was like, so the optics here are really bad. And they had a news conference the following week in Washington, the CBC, the CHC, the AAPI caucus, and the assemblage of the indigenous elected officials. And they presented a picture saying, we're all in this together. The high point for me has been that young people have said, nope, nope, y'all not gonna keep doing this and have it be business as usual. The disappointing thing that I've seen is how US journalism as a profession and as an industry has conducted itself. And I will go back to sitting in 30 Rock and watching the season finale of The Apprentice, where, what's his name, who later became president, you know, you're fired. And all the journalists, they thought it was so, it's all so funny. So as he continued his march, one could call it, you know, goose stepping, but when he continued his march, the things he said and the things he did produced in many journalists, well, you know, that's just him. He's not serious. And if he gets a nomination, he's not really going to run. And I was like, is anybody listening to him? Is anybody watching him? So at the point where he says to Billy Bush, oh, grab him by the pussy. And people are like, oh my God, did he really say that? But as a rule, he was not attacked by mainstream journalists until he sicked the crowds on them at his rallies, right? So in the past 2 years, what I've done is compared it to the previous 6 years or so to take a look at how has journalism covered two of the biggest societal shifts that we've seen in recent decades. And on the one hand, it was with a laissez-faire attitude towards Donald Trump. He was just funny and a joke and a media darling until he wasn't. And then with George Floyd, there was a stereotypical approach, I thought. And I could call it general market media, which is what they call it in advertising. But in my own vernacular now, in my own life, I call it white-owned media. And I think that the way that the lens through which they told us that story was, well, the young people are upset. And here, let's hear what some Black people have to say.
Kevin, what do you think? Paula just really took a knife to journalism. Well, what do you think about that? And particularly as it relates to Black professionals, Black media. Talk about that.
I'm gonna go in a whole different direction. I can't compete with Paula here. You know, I'll be sitting here just listening to her. Although we've been known each other for 40 years. Yeah, at least 40. You know, going back. But where you started about you said we're having a moment, and obviously it's, you know, it's a moment that's gonna forever be etched in history. You know, George Floyd's murder, and his life, his death created a whole worldwide awakening and a movement in so many different ways. And so, yeah, some things did happen. You're right. There were some new jobs created and some new initiatives, and we had BIPOC studios created. We had all kind of things happening, and some of that was of the moment, and we're taking advantage of it. But I want to go back to, in some ways, in empowerment. One of the things I saw, and I worked inside at the time I was at ESPN, so I'm inside the Walt Disney Company. It's the biggest global entertainment company in the world, right? And the conversations that happened in there. It's not so much conversations started by executives in white, but you see the sense of empowerment. And I think that is part of what was missed. A lot of young people, because courage, to have change, really, you need courage. And courage is really an underestimated quality. Because courage, we associated with fighting in wars and a lot of things, but the courage to speak up inside your company and take some action, to lead from within, and go outside sometimes, that's where you see, and that's where I saw the rise. A lot of young people, they weren't going to be silent. Sometimes you see things you don't know, but you don't know how to speak up. But that rise is the most dramatic thing, and it's empowering. And then you take that empowerment. Sometimes you take it inside your company. You force the company to do more. But then you go outside. You get more Tiffany's, more Deshaunas, and you get more people saying, you know what, we can go do this ourselves. One of the, and I just say, his brother that worked with at ESPN is, great filmmaker Marquise Daisy, ESPN Films, worked with him a lot. But like the things that they were doing were like, he and a group of guys, one of the conversations that when I got to LA Times, and I hear from Marquise, and he's talking about he and some of the other, he has a group of brothers who are all kind of filmmakers. They're doing their thing elsewhere, but coming together and putting their own, group together to independently do films elsewhere. And so that sense of empowerment that we can partner, we can go out with each other and do things. To me, that was one of the biggest, most empowering things. And I think look, we did have some changes. We got new editors. Yeah. Dallas Morning News, where I used to work, Black woman's running it. Houston, lots of places around the country where we have change at the top, but you also need that elsewhere, because that's not the only way that work is being created and the only way stories are being told, and to really change the country, you need to see those stories told from different lenses, and they need to be lenses that look like people on the stage.
Thank you for that, Dr. Kendi. I guess what I was trying to get at is we've been here before, haven't we not? And is there something different and more sustaining about this moment?
So I actually think that there is, and well, let me just first say to you, Meghan, I'm so glad we're going to be colleagues, NBCU faculty, and I'm honored to be on this panel with these two legends.
Yes.
And I think even speaking about what they've been able to do through building their own institutions or working within these large conglomerates, I think the number of people who are doing both at the highest of levels, as represented by Paula and Kevin, I think really speaks to this moment, and really speaks to really the focus that Black folks have in terms of building and creating and empowering. But I would also say that where this moment is similar to the past is the way in which the media, through its own racist ideas, have shaped narratives, even as it imagined that it was neutral. And I, just to give an example, in the summer of 2020, when you had this wave of of demonstrations all over the country, many media organizations decided to cover, particularly the TV stations, to cover those instances where there were violent demonstrations, which then created this narrative that the overwhelming number of demonstrations were violent. But then by the end of the summer, we have studies coming out that said that 96, 97% of the demonstrations were peaceful. And then of the remaining ones that were violent, in many cases, the violence was due to police officers harming the demonstrators. But the perception of people based on what they were seeing in the media was completely different. Or even, after the invasion of the Capitol, the way that that was covered, it wasn't covered as if it was a white supremacist coup, right? The term white supremacist, even though we now know it was white supremacist organizations or white supremacist individuals who were presidents who largely colluded to overthrow this election, journalists were shying away from describing it as such, right? Or even in 2021, when this craze about critical race theory emerged. What essentially happened is you on the one hand, speaking about 1/6 and the quote, great lie, journalists, most mainstream journalists were saying this is not true about the idea that the election was stolen. But then when they were reporting on critical race theory, they were not also stating that the conception of critical race theory, that it's anti-white, is also not true. Because apparently, and so I think, and then of course, what emerged is by 2021, this wave of acknowledgement that racism was the existential problem, was overwhelmed by this idea that indeed it was CRT or anti-racism was the existential problem. So then all of the progress and all of the things that we were trying to build, of course, faced this wave, all the while these journalists who allowed this to happen were claiming they were neutral and objective.
That's kind of what I said.
Yes.
Right on, brother.
That is what you said. You were right. But I want to go back to you, Kevin, because you are the executive editor of the Los Angeles Times. We just read some really disturbing things coming out of the city council out there. But you're in a position to change the narrative. What's your vision for doing that? How do you think the media need to operate going forward? And how do we change this conversation where the things that Dr. Kendi outlined aren't so obstructive to our story?
Well, that's a complex question. You give me the hard questions, right? Which is good, because I'm up for it. I mean, I think, look, the American media, it evolves. I mean, we're not, we've always been under critique, and that critique is deserved. I mean, I always say that, just speaking as an editor, I mean, I tell the staff, it starts with how you communicate and how you lead, but we can't be in the thin skin business. That's not our business. We've got to look inwardly. We can't be outside on Mount Olympus looking down, and telling people, assessing people and interrogating. We have to interrogate ourselves. That's part of what we have to do to really be healthy, as an institution, and contribute our part to helping to shape and make the country better. We have to do our part. So a lot of that's representation. I'm going to talk about basic things. How are your newsrooms represented? Who's in those newsrooms? What kind of voices? How are they empowered? So I'm always for empowering people. One of the things, just a concept, open up the newsroom. I talk about a borderless newsroom. I'm not one for hierarchy, and there's a few people sitting in a room like the generals and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's like you got to open it up and make people feel more empowered, because you're not going to get better by yourself. That's the first thing. A few leaders, and I'm gonna do my part, but I can't do all of it, right? It's too big a newsroom. You gotta change the culture of your place to even look at and assess what we do and how we do it. And we do that in some ways, right? Everybody knows we're in a digital era, so we're all digital. I don't care if you're making films. I don't care if you think you're a linear broadcast network, you're a magazine, we're all digital, because that's what we are as a global world. That's how we consume information. It's a digital society. So we're dealing with that, right? We're figuring out new content streams, how to get audience. We have the greatest data ever, right? Never had more data. Blessed with data, technology, you can do anything. And so, but we have to bring that same rigor to figuring out how to reach audiences, to look at how we actually tell stories, how we go about them, how we collect information, who we talk to get our information, and challenge ourselves. And I think that's a harder struggle. I'm not going to say that that's easy, and just because I'm an executive editor, I can wave a wand. It really starts, you've got to change yourself from within. And part of that is sometimes you got to bring new people to help you change, people with different perspectives. Sometimes we got to get outside of our industry, how we hire. And so that's a process, and it's going on at the Los Angeles Times. And as we still build a modern media company, I don't talk about it as a newspaper, because just the term of it, as much as I love newspapers, I grew up delivering them. That's how I came into journalism, reading them. They're beautiful. They're beautifully curated by human beings. I think it's the most brilliant thing that gets done in a day, that you could actually put that out. But that, for people coming up, that doesn't mean what it means to me or Paula and others that are here. And so it's a chance you can remake your entire industry. And so we're bringing content. We got to do things. Sometimes you got to go to communities before you ask people to consume you and get a subscription and give them this great deal. We did have a great deal, by the way. I mean, to get the LA Times is one of the best consumer deals in the world. To get what we deliver, $1 in 6 months, you can't barely get anything like that good. But some people have no habit and don't think they need you. We can't be mad at that. We got to go tell people they need us, and ask for their support. And then sometimes you got to ask for people's forgiveness. If there were generations and you weren't covering them right and you missed them and you didn't show up, you got to ask them, give us a chance now, and have forgiveness. And so there's a lot. That's my complex answer.
It's a good answer.
It can't be like it can't be one time. You're not gonna get to answering that, to have the change that you like to see, just showing up 1 or 2 times. It's a year-long process. Just like all these companies have their strategic plans, 5-year plans. You have to have that. You have to have a plan to do that intentionally.
Paula, Kevin talked about representation, and when you were at NBCU, that was part of your job before you retired, right? But there's a story that I would love for the students in the audience to hear about how you had planned on retiring in 2007, but you changed your mind. Tell our audience the story, and you got somebody fired, and somebody big too.
I would have felt better had I fired somebody, not got somebody fired, but I'm good. I fired a lot of people in my time too. So my very first journalism job was in 1975. I got out of Newhouse and I became a reporter for the Syracuse Herald Journal, which doesn't exist anymore. My last journalism job was as vice president news director at NBC4 in New York. From that one, I went to president and general manager at NBC4 in Los Angeles. Sort of just as that was occurring, things really changed a lot. And so what we had was the creation of MSNBC, and you heard this morning Allison talk about being on the team that helped launch that. There was a point where a radio host by the name of Don Imus, who actually worked for CBS. He was a CBS employee.
Oh, okay.
And CNBC said, oh, let's put a camera inside of his studio when he's doing his show. And that got turned into a television show that aired on CNBC, not MSNBC, because at the time, we were making everything up. We're not sure where everything. So Don Imus, cameras in his studio, Don Imus show, Rutgers women's basketball team playing a game, and Don Imus called these women nappy-headed hoes. I had resolved at the age of 21 that I would retire when I was 58. And at the time, I think I was 56. But I was going to retire early because through a bunch of investments, my brother, who went to Harvard Business School, he created an algorithmic trading company, and I invested in 2 years. It was capitalized at $500 million. I never told anybody at work because it was none of their business. Didn't have anything to do with what I did. I went to work every day. It wasn't like hitting the lottery, and I'm never going to work again. I felt that I had a role, so I was president and general manager of NBC4. Don Imus said what he said. I was flying across the country on Ron Meyer's private jet. Question was, when we landed, we were still in the air, and we heard that Jeff Zucker had suspended Don Imus for 2 weeks while we investigated. Like, investigated what? He said it. What are you investigating? So we landed at Teterboro Airport. I dropped my bags off at the Ritz-Carlton. I walked over to 30 Rock. I went into Jeff's office and said, investigating what? And he said, well, we have to go through the process. What process? Why we got to go through the process? And in the meantime, Al Roker and a bunch of other Black folks inside of that building, Allison was there, the building was almost coming apart because people were so outraged that this man could say what he said about 19, 20-year-old women who were just playing basketball. And this is how he referred to them. At the time, I was a nappy-headed African-American woman. So Zucker says, well, what do we say to the people who said he apologized? And I said, we say, thank God we live in the United States of America where people can speak their minds and be terminated for speaking their minds. And he was like, well, Paul, and then I was in his office when Jeff Immelt called, who was the chairman of GE, our then parent company. And Immelt said, well, what are we going to do? And Zucker is and I'm there and I'm staring at him. And it turned out that the chairman of Procter & Gamble had called Jeff Immelt. So chairman of Procter & Gamble was a white man. He called Immelt a white man and said to him, my wife and my daughters are giving me hell because of what Don Imus said about the Rutgers women's basketball team. So Procter & Gamble cannot advertise on any NBCUniversal property until Don Imus is gone. And I was like, who knew? Who knew that this man? And so I did not get him fired. What did happen was I was asked 2 weeks before to take the diversity job. I said, no, that's like being a consultant. I don't do that kind of stuff. I'm a bottom line. I'm a P&L girl. I make money. And he said, well, but this is the role that we have for you. And I was like, as though I don't have a say in this. I don't have to accept a job. I can do like these sisters did and start my own, go off and do whatever. But after Don Imus said what he said and they investigated is when I was like, no, I'm not leaving now. Now I'm going to make everybody's life hell. So I took the job. I went back to Jeff, and he had asked me if I would take the job of Chief Diversity Officer,
Yeah.
Executive Vice President, because we were bringing in Universal. We didn't own Universal. We were bringing it into the company, and somebody needed to lead that effort. And I had brought in Telemundo. So I was part of the team that brought in Telemundo. I brought in the 2 Telemundo stations in LA. So what ultimately happened was I said to Jeff, first down Imus goes.
That's what I heard, sorry.
First down Imus goes. And then I only report to the CEO. No HR, no intermediary. And he said, oh, well, I think we can do that. I said, and since it's an enterprise-wide job, I become a GE company officer. He said, well, I don't control that. I said, I know. He said, well, I have to take that to Jeff Immelt. I said, okay, I'm good with that. And then he contacted Jeff Immelt. He looked at me like I was crazy. He really did. He was like, you really want me to? So he contacted Immelt, and he said to me the next day, Jeff Immelt says he'll do it, but he can't do it until the next board meeting, which is going to be in October. So you take the job now, and then it'll become a company officer. And I said, now, why would I do that? Why would I do that? And he was like, what? I said, would you do that?
Good question.
And then he said, but they're not having a board meeting until October. I said, but that's why God made telephones. Tell Jeff a 1-item quickie. It'll be a 5-minute call. Let's make Paula Madison a company officer. And he said, okay.
Wow.
So he called Immelt, and within like 2 days, I was the second Black female company officer at GE.
Wow. Wow.
I tell that story because it's for all the people who are concerned about imposter syndrome.
That's right.
I never had a company officer job before. I didn't even know what went into being a company officer, but I knew that white dudes had it. At some point, they didn't know how to do it either.
But at that point, you had been at the company a long time. Do you think you would have had that?
Upon walking in the door, the president of Television Stations Division asked me, Paula, what do I say to the Jewish community in New York when they find out that you were a Black Muslim? What do I say to them?
What did you say?
And I said, what do I say to the Black community when they ask me if you had gone to a kibbutzim when you were 17 years old?
Wow.
And he looked at me and I looked at him. And I said, you brought me here for an interview, right? I'm not in the Nation of Islam anymore. I said, we don't refer to ourselves as Black Muslims, but I'm not in the Nation of Islam anymore. But if that's what you wanted to talk to me about, if you did not want to talk to me about being assistant news director at WNBC, then you should have told me that before I got on a plane to come here. And I would have told you I'm not interested in that conversation. I said, so as far as I'm concerned, this is the last time we will discuss this because I already have a job and I can go get a different job.
Wow.
And then I got hired.
Wow. I mean, not many people are that empowered, right, Dr. Kendi? I mean, you talk about how do you, there's something that I really wanted you to address while I have you on stage here. And that is some of the things that Paula touched on, being empowered, dealing with the structures that are embedded in news and media organizations. But there's something that you've talked about that I find extremely fascinating in terms of how to be an anti-racist journalist. And I want you to sort of expand on what do you mean when you say that? And what do you tell news editors when you meet them, what that means?
Well, first, I just want to share, that like what Paula described was this incredible recognition of how power operates.
That's right.
And I think the unfortunate truth is, I think in many ways people like us haven't necessarily been taught how to navigate power, how to exercise power, how to leverage power, how, when you're in a position of power. And so I think in many ways people were given a crash course on power, and I just wanted to for that. And I'm saying that because one of the areas that we don't talk enough about, particularly as it relates to racial justice, is power. And I
Empowered, right?
yeah, and feeling empowered, and how power works and how power shifts, and I think that we need to really be learning from people like Kevin and Paula who understands how power works. But to your question, I think that well, I mean, the easy answer is just to check out The Emancipator, and we have
Deborah is here.
who of course is our editor. Because in many ways, as The Emancipator, we're trying to model what it means to be an anti-racist journalist.
Right, yeah.
And I'll say that I think it's important for an anti-racist journalist to assume at a basic level that there isn't anything wrong with groups of people. So the investigator in the journalist isn't trying to figure out what's wrong with those Black people, what's wrong with those Native folks. A journalist is trying to figure out what's wrong with policies and practices and systems and and conditions. Or if that journalist is conveying the experiences and the lives of, let's say, Black people, that journalist is seeking to show the complexity, the imperfections, of Black life, the humanity, because that's what makes Black people human. And as opposed to journalists of the past who either would show Black people as these super people or Black people as these inferior people. It was never this sort of complicated, complex presentation, of Black life. And I think that the anti-racist journalist is seeking, to do that. And I also think that journalist is really seeking to meet people where they are, and the way Kevin was just talking about, in terms of, trying to figure out, who has been undercovered, who's been covered the wrong way, allow the community to speak to the journalist, so then the journalist can reflect that back to the community, as opposed to the journalist going into the community and telling the community about itself.
That's right. So I do want to invite you to participate in this conversation. If you have a question. Okay, we have one, Kelly, and then Phil.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you for the lessons in power, this panel. I'm Kelly Chun. I'm a professor of practice. I just started in public relations. Boring though it may be. We need to have a conversation about multicultural. But at any rate, I'm a professor of practice at the College of Communication, just started in September. As someone who lived and worked in Nigeria for a year and a half, thanks to Randy Daniels and NABJ, I'm very much interested in your business model, Paula, and the Africa Channel and your struggle for survival. And I also have a question for Kevin, how the Undefeated became Anti.
Okay, you want to go first and then Paula? Sorry, or however you want to do.
Well, that's a fairly, it's both complex, but I'll try to keep it simple. It's very complex. I mean, the bottom line, and this happened after I was gone. So it didn't become Anscape while I was there. I was already left. But part of it really is just about trademark, right? When the Undefeated started, there was Undefeated Streetwear brand. And this goes back to something what Tiffany alluded to when she was talking about tribe and tribe, you know. But those who started the Undefeated, you know, when we were just going to be a website, and this predates me, the trademark covered that. And we were always going to try to build into a global brand, Black brand for Disney, you know, and carry it across Disney. And we were in the process of doing it. And the greater that the Undefeated became and moving out into book imprint, record label, now they have independent studio, all of this expansion required, you know, both, you got to have consumer products, if you're going to be a big global brand. And so the bottom line was unable to reach the right kind of agreement, you know, with Undefeated. I think it should have been able to do that earlier. And it got into a trademark situation, and they rebranded and they came up with Anscape. I didn't have anything to do with the name per se.
Looking for Undefeated on Twitter.
Yeah. It was not like, hey, we don't like the Undefeated, we're going to go to Anscape. It was just that they couldn't, as it expanded, couldn't carry the trademark, and they had to rebrand and come up with another name.
And Paula, the Africa Channel.
Sure. So the Africa Channel was founded, I think, 18 years ago by James Makawa, and then my family invested in it. What we didn't realize at the time was that I think right now there are probably only 2 independently owned single cable networks, the Africa Channel being one. And that's because as the sort of bundling happened, you know, you have Disney that's got probably 20, ABC Disney's probably got 20, NBCUniversal has however many, Discovery has, so there are not very many independently owned. And so for us, we had to expand from just the linear Africa Channel to, if you look for us on Tubi, Pluto, et cetera, the fast channels, we're called Demand Africa, right? And then we have the Africa Channel Studios, the Africa Channel being TAC, so TAC Studios. So for us, it has been an upward struggle over these many years to the point where we have about 25 million subscribers in the US, Canada, the Caribbean, and Brazil. Why Brazil, you ask? I don't know, but Brazil. So, and then what does happen is at every point where there's the push for renewal, we have to jump through all kinds of hoops. And that's largely because the Africa Channel is the only independently owned channel that is focused on African lifestyle, culture, right? Were we to attempt to become more like BET or TV One, I'm sure that our license would be pulled because, well, we already have African American stuff. And, you know, Mark used to work for the Africa Channel, so he certainly knows what that struggle, that climb is about. So what ultimately is the business model? The business model really was more solidified about 10 years ago when we stopped having to write checks to close the financial gap annually. So the Africa Channel now is self-sustaining, self-supporting. But that's really why we sold the Sparks. And when I retired, I became the CEO of the Los Angeles Sparks. And it didn't take long before I reduced a consistent $1 million+ deficit annually to about 200,000. But the WNBA teams don't make money. And they don't make money because unless they are owned by a franchise owner that also owns, say, for example, an NBA team or an NFL team, where it can be amortized, bundled. If you want to buy advertising for the Lakers, you have to now buy advertising for the Sparks. So they get bundled in there. But I concluded, unlike with the Africa Channel, the Sparks was an expensive hobby, and I don't need any more hobbies. So as much as I wanted to support women's basketball, it was just a drain, a financial drain on my family's coffers.
Thank you. Philip?
Thank you. I want to thank the panel. But let me tell you, first of all, what I'm thanking you for. I'm thanking you for sharing your confidence.
That's right.
Because that can be considered an intangible, but it is such a powerful force in the context of storytelling and of trying to convince a broad audience. And I'm going to now turn to another point. What I'm obsessed with this year, first as a investigative journalist, and secondly, as part of my Shorenstein Fellowship at Harvard, is this bifurcation of America. It's probably greater than a bifurcation. People describe it as a threat to democracy. We're talking right now actually about an assault on democracy, but not democracy simply, pluralistic democracy, multiracial democracy. And I raise it in that context because every day I'm trying to figure out, how do you basically convince an entire population, the people of this country, Black folk across every spectrum, that we're in more than a critical moment. It's an existential moment. And I think a lot of folks know that, but quite a few people don't. You can tell that by voting patterns, first of all. We will know in a few weeks just how concerned and serious we are about this issue. But I would ask the three of you, what stories would you tell to, if you will, in brief, to describe the moment we are in and the extent of that threat to multiracial, pluralistic democracy and increasingly bifurcated America?
Who wants to go first? The professor.
Wow, there's so many stories. Well, thank you for raising this issue. And I think the first story that came to mind that really, to me, demonstrates this bifurcation is when you have one of the more known and powerful Black artists in the world deciding to use his platform to project that white lives matter, and then sort of continuing with anti-Semitic ideas and claiming he can't be anti-Semitic, and within the Black community, you have obviously many people challenging him, but then you also have people supporting. And I think it's indicative of within different communities, you have people who, in this moment in time, where we should be focused on the role that bigotry is playing, climate change, attack on democracy, nuclear war, pandemics that are threatening our existence as human beings. Instead, we're imagining that other group, is the source, of our pain. And so to me, that's one of the stories that comes to mind. And I think it's I personally haven't really spoke about that story, just because to me it's so painful. But I think it's indicative of this moment that we're in, and I also think it's indicative of how minds can be so lost. And anyway, let me stop there before I say something that's going.
Anybody else?
There was a reference to this when I'm about to raise on the earlier panel, but the story that I would do is what we're experiencing is the reaction to 8 years of Obama being president. and that there is a significant percentage of the population in this country who right now, using street vernacular, got their noses out of joint because what were we thinking voting for him? And so what I think we're facing now is, we saw it all across Western Europe. We're starting to see it in Eastern Europe. If you remember, not too many months ago, as we saw folks trying to escape Ukraine, and all of the students who were from the continent of Africa, who were at the borders, not being allowed out, not being allowed on trains, because I won't even begin to finish that sentence. But what I'm saying here is that when we talk about a democracy, and I'm a first-generation US citizen born here, when we talk about a democracy, we have to stop, as Black people, deluding ourselves into believing that we were ever included in democracy. We never were. Whether it was 3/5 of a man, whether it was Sojourner Truth asking white women, ain't I a woman, as she wanted to speak at the convention for suffrage, ain't I a woman? She wasn't saying to Black people, ain't I a woman? She was saying, ain't I a woman too? Can I address the question of voting rights? This has been the struggle that has gone on in these United States from the very inception of this nation. It's not resolved. And there was a sister earlier here, I don't think she's still here, but she's a psychiatrist. And she, right? And she talked about a man who brought a white man who brought his white son to her for treatment. She's a pediatric psychiatrist. And someone asked her, one of her colleagues asked her some weeks later, do you not see the swastika on that man's neck? And she said she hadn't seen it. And then she realized she had seen it, but she couldn't confront it. And I guess what I'm raising here is, we talk about a reckoning, but for Black people in the United States, we have to admit and understand and accept that we got to come up with strategies for survival, not strategies for equality, because it's elusive. We're not going to be given equality, right? That's not what's going to happen. I don't know whether I expect you to give me equality. I would appreciate you leaving me alone and letting me live my life as best as an equal as I can. But the bestowal, we've seen what that means. And it's amounted to, yeah, some of us are going to get better jobs, right? But I will say to you right now, as we are celebrating post the murder of George Floyd, how many of us got better positions? Let's remember that David Zaslav over at Warner Discovery, almost every Black executive in that company is now gone. People were laid off in the hundreds, and those people were overwhelmingly telling alternative stories. So it's cyclical. We started out, I was kind of smiling, going, well, eventually it's going to come. It's cyclical. It depends on the level and the amount of guilt, the level and the amount of what can we do to make this right. And I am so hopeful, in spite of what I'm saying, I am so hopeful that this same generation that locked arms and took to the streets with nonviolent protests regarding after the murder of George Floyd, that they're saying, done. Yes. We're not going to perpetuate this. That's what I'm praying for. That's what I'm hoping for. But that's the story I would turn the camera and the pens right about that. Let's see what that story is about.
Well, they're both great storytellers. You know, I want to speak about, and I'll be brief. I mean, one thing, I'll make 2 points. One, and I'm going to credit many of you know Rashad Robinson, who runs Color of Change, and happened to be at the LA Times doing a presentation. We bring people in times, get experts. Made a really good point. It's made before, but we talk about a lot of times systems. We focus on systems. Okay, voter suppression as a thing. He said, don't focus on voter suppression so much. Focus on the suppressors. And it's a different way of looking at that subject. And I guess I want to carry it to the more about beyond the what story as to how we do the work. Like some things that used to be, not everything back in the day, as they say, was great, but some things back in the day are better, right? Like reporting. We've gotten so macro a lot of times in our reporting. I mean, we'll get some voices and cherry pick them, but we got macro because we got data, and that has its purpose. But we don't have as much penetrating, granular street reporting as I think I think that's a deficit in just how we go about it. I'd say this to the BU COM and journalism. I think we're developing some programs like how to go and penetrate neighborhoods and communities where you're the only person, you're the only man on the moon, only woman on the moon. It's just you. There's nobody else is here. And to live in places, really to absorb and understand and that's what my plea is for. That's what is times when you have the most challenging times in the country is that you need reporters in places. Yeah. They've got to embed it in living and really getting stories from the ground. And I think that is what I think we need to do more. And that I could carry that to a lot of different subjects and topics, but it's a kind of work that will unearth stuff that is not familiar. There are too many stories where I read the story, I know what the person's gonna say. I see the quote, I see how it's placed, I got an anecdote, somebody came and visited somebody and they talked to somebody and they took some notes and got out of there and and there it is. But I want revelation, and we need more revelatory reporting.
Can I just acknowledge and compliment Kevin, because after 22 years of living in Los Angeles, this series of stories, this saga of the 3 elected officials and the Labor Federation head who conspired to try to take as much power away from African Americans in terms of redistricting. The LA Times has covered that story in a way that I've never seen the LA Times cover any story. And I've been pointing out to friends and colleagues that a brother who has been my boy for more than 40 years has walked into Los Angeles and has come into looking at this city with a different lens and not in a superficial fashion. I will make up that I figure you must have at least 12 to 15 reporters assigned to this story on a daily basis, because the volume and the intensity and the depth, and I said, forgive my vernacular, but I sit at home going, holy shit, they got that one too. They going at it from that angle. And I'm in the middle of a lot of folks, just to give you how, I used to be vice president of Los Angeles Police Commission. So I was police commissioner in Los Angeles. How and why the mayor did that, I don't know. And he probably still regrets it to this day. But what I'm saying, the level of folks with whom I interact, and I'm saying to them, note what's happened at the LA Times, and that this probably will be a catalyst for bridging a lot of the racial division that goes on and has been going on in LA, simmering just below the surface. Because now, like, the covers have been taken off and people are going, nope, we can't have this. And so the coalitions really are being built. So thank you so much, my brother.
Appreciate that. I need to take you on the road with me.
There was some deep wisdom in both what all 3 of you said, and I love what you said, new strategies for survival, right? Want a revelation. I love that. We have time for one last question.
Hi, my name is Kathy. For the longest time, I was in the sales department at WBZ, an NBC affiliate, and then I ran the sales department at WGBH, the PBS station in Boston. And thank you for the panel. All of you are just excellent. The thing that struck me today were the two words, power and courage. And I have to say, to whom much has given, much is expected. But for a lot of people, a lot has been given, and they sort of want to keep it, and they don't want to rock the boat. They have the power, but they don't have the courage. And could each of you just briefly talk about, for those of you who clearly have the power and you clearly have the courage, when the two weren't meeting at the same time, because in order for you to do your job effectively, for those of us that are on the sideline, so to speak, what would you say to your younger, inexperienced self about how to make it better, how to reach back and stand up, much like you did, Paula, to Zucker and Imelt? Because I find that's what's really lacking. They have the power, but they don't have the courage. Thank you.
That's a fantastic point. As you answer, could you also provide one tip to the young people that are here?
So if you haven't figured it out yet in terms of what I do, I spend a lot of time strategizing. Relaxation for me is figuring out a strategy, right? So years ago, what I had decided was that 45 minutes annually that you get one-on-one with your immediate supervisor, where that person gives you what's called a performance review, right? What I realized was when I went into that session, at some point in that conversation, I was going to be on the defensive, because they're walking in the room with something they got to pull out that you didn't do right. So my strategy was, now how do I blow that up? So here's my strategy, and it has to do with power. Quarterly, I would go to my immediate supervisor and I'd say something on the order of, "You got 5 minutes? Sure, what's up? Can you just tell me how I'm doing?" "What do you mean?" "Well, just give me just tell me how you think I'm doing. Like, am I, meeting your expectations? That last project I worked on, blah, 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 blah." And what that does is a couple of things. What it says is that you're telling that supervisor, I'm not afraid to hear a critique. In fact, I'm asking you for a critique. I look like angry Black woman. See, I'm angry Black woman. But I'm going to you and saying, hey, you got 5 minutes? And when I get those 5 minutes, the last thing I'm going to be is angry Black woman. I'm asking for, how am I doing? And then I say, okay, can I come back to you in a couple of months just to sort of catch up and maybe you can give me an update? So it's not random. The next quarter I go back and I say, so last time we talked, it was blah, 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 and XYZ, and I've been doing da, 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 da. I don't know if you noticed it. Like, so how am I doing now? Whoa, well, you've improved. But there's a couple of other things you should do. Great. I put those into place. By the time we get to the fourth quarter and I get my 45 minutes, you know what we're not talking about? The previous 12 months.
So you went from 5 minutes to 45 minutes.
Well, because every year you get a performance evaluation, right? So I've kissed it off in a series of total maybe 15 minutes of you giving me feedback throughout the year. My 45 minutes are spent on, so what do you think the next role is for me?
Good, 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 good.
Now, what we know is that he's not afraid, often it's a he. What we know is that he's not afraid of me because I've disarmed him the entire time by being collaborative, taking his points, coming back to him and asking how'd I do. I may challenge on occasion, but it's not a challenge like, well, what are you talking about? I never did that. It would be like, oh, well, I hadn't really seen it that way, but I guess I see your point. Now, what did that mean? That meant that after that, every role I had was what that person suggested, and here was what my request was. Well, if I track towards that position, can I count on you for support? Sure, I'd be happy to support you. So you were in sales. How many news directors became general managers and didn't come through sales? I don't know nothing about sales. So what I asked was, so I get 6 weeks vacation. Can I give up 2 weeks of my vacation and just hang out in the sales department like a fly on the wall? I won't get in the way, but I just want to understand how it works. Paula, you don't need to go in the sales department. You don't need to know how it works. You'll have a great vice president of sales. And I was like, well, I'd feel much better if you don't need to do that. And what happened next? I was made president and general manager. That's a strategy, right? Because what it is not is me sitting there full of trepidation that we know you go into a performance evaluation with every year. It takes your power away. I've walked in already empowered. And in fact, my boss doesn't know that I'm actually going to manipulate him or her into being my champion and advocate. You understand? So strategy-wise, it's that whatever it is that you are facing, I'll bring up this phrase imposter syndrome, which I hate, but whatever it is that makes you think that that may be what you're struggling with, figure out how to work around that, because that's false. That is completely false. Now what you have to do is figure out how to squash it, how to step on it, and how to make it your own. And overwhelmingly it would be women, not necessarily Black women, but overwhelmingly it would be women. And I'd say to them, pretend that you're putting on a onesie and it's called power. You gotta slip into it, make it fit your body, rub all over it, squirm, make sure it fits tight, get comfortable, and walk out in that onesie saying, look at me, don't I look good, right? If you can't do that, then what you need to do is find somebody to support who's gonna bring you along.
Wow, great. Kim, that was great. Wow.
Ain't nobody top that.
You're gonna have to come up with something.
Maybe I got a couple simple things. I mean, not as dynamic as my sister here, but sometimes it helps to just find your tribe. Get who else can you collect, so that you don't feel alone, in whatever your dilemma, that you develop some power with others. If you already have it, right, then that's where the bravery really comes in. That's where go find someone to believe in. It doesn't do good to me to sit someplace or anybody, and you're not going to go wrap your arms around somebody else and help lift them. And so from that end, I think about that. And the other thing is just history. I think it's always good to remind. I mean, I was at the Undefeated sometimes, and in the day, it's a new place, and sometimes people get upset. There are battles out on Twitter, there are fights, there's trolling, and I get it. I don't want to, Merida spent years studying it, so I don't want to belittle what it is and what can happen. But I said, I think about Thurgood Marshall going down in the dark roads, people smuggling them into, houses under death threats, going in, winning 29 out of, 32 cases of Supreme Court, going into the judges and winning cases and then getting out of town, breaking Jim Crow's back, the journalists that had to work, whether it's Simeon Booker, people that had to go down and cover them until couldn't eat, in restaurants. And so reminding people of how we're here. You know, it's not saying this is panacea, but people did battles to get us here. So then that's where our obligation, you know. Lynn Adrian's there. I see some people that are there when I was in school. You know, we started a Black student newspaper, you know. One did not exist. I spent most of my time at Boston University working on this little ragtag thing that we were trying to put out and put it in reps because we thought that was important to do. And guess who was our advisor? Was Bill Worthy. Bill Worthy, who was a pioneering African-American journalist, the first one to get into back when it was communist China. That was our advisor. Lost his job, by the way, at Boston University. In fact, we ended up literally skipping graduation, the big graduation, some of us, because we want to break the picket line and protest it. And so you just, you know, you can conjure up history, you know, and know that people did things to be here. And that's like fortification when you think about that. And so it's fortification, obligation. And so like you can't be stopped. Like, you know, I get trolled on Twitter. I look at stuff. I don't even, it doesn't faze me at all. You know, I'm like, you know, because I'm thinking like people literally lost their lives, were shot in their driveways, you know, just so we could be on the stage. So that's it.
And I would say, speaking specifically about courage, so I follow the anonymous philosopher who once stated that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the strength to do what's right in the face of it. And I oftentimes think of the opposite of courage, which is cowardice, which is the inability to gather the strength to do what's right in the face of fear. And I also tend to think about sometimes people fear what could happen to them, you know, if they resist, if they try to go out on their own, if they move into that new position that they feel almost an imposter in. And I always try to balance that with what could happen if I don't resist, if I don't move into that position, like if I don't try out something new. Because if we're just thinking about the first one, right? Well, what could happen to me if I don't resist? We're not going to think about what's literally already happening to us in that moment, right? And so I think that sort of allows me to gain the courage. I think that could be helpful. But then I think some more, even about the concept of fear itself. And I'm even deeply conflicted about the notion of fear. And I never forget watching has anybody seen the movie After Earth with Will Smith and his son? And just for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm not going to give you the whole story, but it's basically about Will Smith and his son are abandoned on this sort of island, and Will Smith is hurt, and his son has to defeat this beast that is scary that Will has already defeated on another planet, and in order basically for them to go on. And there's a scene in which Will, I forget his name of his character in the movie, in which Will is talking to his son to try to get him to overcome the fear that he has of facing this just incredibly scary beast. And Will says, and I'm paraphrasing, that fear doesn't exist. Now, danger is real, right? And there is danger, but fear is basically a product of the imagination. And so he challenges his son to separate or really eliminate the construct of fear and focus on danger. And then once you understand that this is dangerous, it then allows you, going back to Paula's point, to then strategize of how to protect yourself, as you defeat what's scary.
Wow. Please, please, please give our panel a resounding round of applause. We didn't even touch on a whole bunch of other topics I wanted to talk about: the loss of local news, distrust in the media, whatever happened to the Black News Network. But thank you all for being here, and it was a pleasure to moderate this panel. And back to the dean.
So I'm really glad you saved some things for the next time. I hope we'll be gathering. I hope you all can stay for a few more minutes. We have upstairs some snacks and beverages for a little reception. Obviously, the conversation should only begin and continue here. We at the College of Communication really believe in the power of good communication to help change the world in a positive way. I really feel like our wonderful speakers today and all day really helped us with some new insights, and I'm just so grateful. So please, can we thank us all again? I'll see you outside. Thank you.